The lawyer's voice crackled through my phone speaker as I navigated the narrow highway cutting through eastern Oregon. "Mr. Patterson, I understand this is unexpected, but your uncle's will was very specific. The property transfers to you immediately upon his passing. I'd never met Uncle Walter. He was my father's older brother, the one who'd left the family decades before I was born, over some dispute no one would ever explain to me. Growing up, his name was mentioned maybe 3 times, always in hushed tones that suggested the topic was forbidden territory. And now, at 34 years old, working a dead-end job, managing a sporting goods store in Portland, I was inheriting a farm I'd never seen from a man I'd never known. The inheritance felt less like a gift and more like a puzzle I hadn't asked to solve. Walter Patterson had died at 81, alone in a nursing home in Baker City, with no children, no spouse, and apparently no friends who came forward to claim his belongings. The lawyer explained that Walter had updated his will just 18 months ago, specifically naming me as sole beneficiary of his 47-acre farm. No explanation, no letter, just legal documents transferring ownership of land I couldn't picture and didn't want. My girlfriend Sarah had been supportive when I told her about the inheritance, though I could see the concern in her eyes. "Maybe it's a sign," she'd said. "You've been talking about wanting a change, wanting something more meaningful than retail management." She wasn't wrong. I'd been feeling stuck for years, going through motions that led nowhere, watching my college friends build careers while I rearranged fishing rod displays and dealt with customer complaints about boot sizes. But inheriting a farm wasn't the kind of change I'd imagined. I knew nothing about agriculture, had no interest in rural life, and planned to sell the property as quickly as possible. The GPS directed me off the highway onto increasingly remote roads. Pavement gave way to gravel, and gravel eventually became little more than packed dirt with deep ruts worn by decades of truck tires. The landscape was beautiful in a stark, lonely way. Rolling hills covered in dried grass, scattered juniper trees, and a sky so vast it made me feel insignificant. This was the kind of place people came to disappear, and apparently that's exactly what Uncle Walter had done. The farmhouse appeared suddenly as I crested a hill, a weathered 2-story structure that looked like it had been fighting a losing battle against time and elements for at least 30 years. Grey paint peeled in long strips from the siding. The front porch sagged noticeably on the left side. Several windows were boarded up, and the roof looked like it had survived multiple generations of harsh winters through sheer stubbornness. Behind the house stood a large barn in slightly better condition. Its red paint faded to a dusty pink, and beyond that, fencing stretched across fields that had clearly gone unworked for years. I pulled up to the house and sat in my car for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to reconcile this isolated, decrepit property with the vague, romantic notion I'd had of a charming country home I could quickly flip for profit. This wasn't charming, this was work, expensive work, the kind that would drain my savings before I could even think about selling. The front door was locked, but the key the lawyer had given me turned smoothly in the deadbolt. That small detail surprised me. Everything else suggested neglect, but someone had maintained the locks. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the empty rooms beyond, and I stepped into my uncle's life for the first time. The interior was dark, musty, and cold. Furniture sat beneath white sheets, like ghosts waiting to be acknowledged. Dust covered every surface thick enough to show my fingerprints when I touched the hallway table. But beneath the abandonment, I could sense something else. This house had been lived in, truly lived in, by someone who'd cared about it once. Family photos lined the staircase wall, their faces obscured by grime and shadows. A bookshelf in what appeared to be the living room held hundreds of volumes, their spines faded but organized with care. In the kitchen, dishes still sat in the drainer beside the sink, as if Walter had simply walked away one day and never returned. I spent the afternoon exploring room by room, trying to build a picture of the uncle I'd never known. His bedroom was sparse but tidy. The closet held work clothes, flannel shirts, denim worn soft with age. A nightstand drawer contained reading glasses, a pocket watch that had stopped at 3:47, and a small leather journal with entries dating back to 1983. I flipped through it briefly, seeing dense handwriting that would take time to decipher, then set it aside for later examination. The second floor had 3 additional bedrooms, all empty except for basic furniture. One room appeared to have been set up as an office, with a desk facing the window that overlooked the back fields. Papers were stacked neatly, bills and farm records going back decades, all meticulously organized. Whatever else Uncle Walter had been, he'd been methodical about documentation. As evening approached, I realized I hadn't made any practical arrangements for staying the night. The nearest motel was 25 miles back the way I'd come, and I was exhausted from the 4-hour drive. The farmhouse had electricity. The lawyer had assured me of that much, and when I tested the light switches, bare bulbs flickered to life throughout the first floor. The water worked too, though it ran rust-colored for several minutes before clearing. I could survive one night here, maybe 2, while I figured out what needed to be done before putting the place on the market. I was heating a can of soup on the ancient gas stove when I heard the first rumble of thunder. Through the kitchen window, I watched dark clouds building on the western horizon, moving fast across the open landscape. The weather forecast hadn't mentioned storms, but out here, weather seemed to make its own rules. Within 20 minutes, rain began pelting the roof, and soon the storm arrived in full force. The storm hit with a ferocity I'd never experienced in the city. Rain hammered the farmhouse roof like thousands of tiny fists demanding entry. Wind howled through gaps in the window frames, creating an eerie whistling that made the entire structure groan and shift. I sat in the living room with my soup, watching lightning illuminate the fields in stark white flashes, counting the seconds until thunder shook the walls. The storm was directly overhead and growing stronger. Around 9 o'clock, the power failed. One moment I was reading Walter's journal by lamplight, the next I was plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by lightning strikes. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to navigate to the kitchen where I'd seen candles earlier. As I lit the third candle, a sound cut through the storm's roar. A sharp crack, followed by a tremendous crash that made the entire house shudder. My first thought was that a tree had fallen on the roof, but when I rushed to the windows, I couldn't see any damage to the house itself. Another lightning flash illuminated the barn, and I saw it. The entire back section of the barn had collapsed inward. The roof caved in like something had struck it from above. Even from the house, I could see wooden beams jutting at wrong angles, debris scattered across the muddy ground. I should have waited until morning. Any sensible person would have stayed inside, waited for the storm to pass, assessed damage in daylight, but something pulled me toward that barn. Maybe it was the instinct that destruction reveals what was hidden, or maybe it was simply morbid curiosity about what 47 acres of liability looked like when nature decided to reclaim it. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed a flashlight from my car, and ran through the driving rain toward the collapsed structure. The barn's front section remained intact, its large sliding doors still secure on their tracks. I entered there, sweeping my flashlight across the interior. The front half had clearly been used for equipment storage. An ancient tractor sat rusting in one corner, its tires flat and rotted. Hand tools hung on pegboards, their outlines traced in dust where they'd hung for years. Hay bales stacked to the ceiling had compressed into solid blocks of dried grass. Everything spoke of a farm that had stopped operating long ago, frozen in time when Walter could no longer maintain it. But it was the back section, now open to the raging storm, where things got interesting. The collapsed roof had fallen into what appeared to be a workspace that had been sealed off from the rest of the barn. As I approached carefully, testing each step on the debris-strewn floor, my flashlight caught something that made no sense. Beneath the broken rafters and twisted metal roofing, I could see concrete stairs leading down into darkness. A basement. The barn had a basement, and the collapse had revealed its entrance like opening a tomb that had been sealed for decades. I stood at the edge of the stairs, rain soaking through my jacket, while my mind tried to process what I was seeing. Who builds a basement under a barn? And more importantly, why would Walter have sealed it off so completely that even the stairs were hidden? Every rational thought told me to go back to the house, wait for morning, maybe call someone with authority to explore whatever this was. But rationality had stopped making sense the moment I inherited a farm from an uncle I'd never met. I descended the concrete stairs slowly, my flashlight beam bouncing off walls that closed in around me as I went deeper underground. The stairs ended at a heavy wooden door, the kind you'd expect on a bank vault rather than a farm building. It wasn't locked, but the hinges resisted when I pulled, groaning in protest at being disturbed after what must have been years of stillness. The door finally gave way, swinging open to reveal a room that took my breath away. It was a workshop, but unlike anything I'd ever seen. The space was about 20 feet square with concrete walls and a ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. Workbenches lined 3 walls, covered with tools, materials and projects in various stages of completion. But these weren't farm tools or equipment repairs. These were musical instruments. Violins, cellos, guitars, mandolins, some finished and gleaming even in my flashlight beam, others half-formed, showing the skeleton of what they would become. I moved deeper into the room, my wet shoes squeaking on the concrete floor, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. Each instrument appeared to be handcrafted with extraordinary care. The finished pieces were works of art, their wood selected for grain and color, their curves perfect, their details precise. Labels inside the violins bore Walter Patterson's name, and dates ranging from 1979 to 2018. He'd been making instruments down here for nearly 40 years, in secret, in a sealed basement beneath a barn on a forgotten farm. Along the back wall, I found filing cabinets full of designs, sketches and notes written in the same meticulous hand I'd seen in the journal upstairs. Walter had documented everything. The source of each piece of wood, the curing time, the construction process, adjustments made to improve sound quality. These weren't the notes of a hobbyist. This was the work of a master craftsman who dedicated his life to perfection in isolation. But it was what I found on the last workbench that broke my heart. A violin, nearly complete, sat in a padded vise. Beside it lay a handwritten note, dated just 3 months before Walter's death. "For Michael," it read, "my brother's son, may he find in music what I found in silence, a way home." Michael was my father's name. This instrument had been meant for him, a bridge across decades of silence, an apology or explanation crafted in wood and strings that would never be delivered. I stood in that underground workshop while the storm raged above, holding a note written to a father I'd lost 5 years earlier, and something inside me cracked open. All my plans to quickly sell this property and return to my comfortable, meaningless life in Portland suddenly seemed impossible. Uncle Walter hadn't just left me a farm. He'd left me a mystery, a legacy, and maybe, if I was brave enough to stay and understand it, a purpose I'd been searching for without knowing it. If you found yourself drawn into this story of hidden legacies and second chances, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. There's something powerful about discovering that the things we inherit aren't always what they seem on the surface. And speaking of discoveries, I'm curious, have you ever found something unexpected that changed your perspective on a family member you thought you knew? Drop a comment below and share your story. Sometimes the most meaningful connections happen when we're willing to dig a little deeper, quite literally in this case. Now let's continue with what Michael discovered as he began to unravel his uncle's 40-year secret. I spent the rest of that storm-torn night in the underground workshop, unable to leave, unable to fully process what I'd discovered. As dawn broke and pale light filtered through the collapsed section of the barn above, I carefully examined each instrument. There were 23 completed pieces in total, each one tagged with a name and date. Most of the names meant nothing to me, but a few sparked vague recognition. People from Baker City, musicians maybe, or students Walter had intended these instruments for but never delivered. The rain had stopped by sunrise, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth. I climbed out of the barn's basement, exhausted and overwhelmed, to find the property transformed by morning light. What had seemed desolate and abandoned the day before now revealed subtle signs of care beneath the neglect. The fields, though overgrown, had been terraced to prevent erosion. The orchard behind the house, bare branches reaching toward the sky, stood in neat rows that suggested someone had once tended them with purpose. Even the disrepair spoke of a property that had been deeply loved before time and circumstance forced its caretaker to let go. I returned to the house and finally opened Walter's journal properly, settling into the dusty living room as morning sun streamed through grimy windows. The entries began in 1983, the year after some event Walter referred to only as the leaving. His writing was precise but emotional, revealing a man wrestling with profound loss and searching for meaning in isolation. March 15th, 1983. 47 days since the leaving. Michael won't return my calls. Mother says I've made my choice and must live with it. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. But I can't go back. I can't pretend anymore. The music is all I have left that feels true. The entries continued sporadically through the years, documenting Walter's journey from angry exile to acceptance, to something like peace. He'd left the family over his sexuality. I gradually understood. In 1982, in a conservative rural community, being gay wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was grounds for complete rejection. Walter's father had given him an ultimatum: deny who he was or leave the family. Walter had chosen honesty and lost everything except this farm, which had been his grandmother's property and passed directly to him. June 3rd, 1985. Started the basement workshop today. If I'm going to be alone, I might as well build something beautiful. The instruments don't judge. They don't care who holds them or who made them. They just want to sing. Through the journal, I watched my uncle transform his pain into artistry. He taught himself luthery through books ordered from distant cities, through trial and error, through countless failures that led eventually to mastery. The instruments became his family, each one crafted with the love he couldn't express to the people who'd rejected him. And somewhere in that process, he'd found contentment, if not happiness. Later entries mentioned occasional trips to Portland, to Seattle, even to San Francisco. Walter had built a life beyond the farm, connections with other people who understood what it meant to live authentically despite the cost. But he always returned here, to this isolated property where he could work undisturbed, where his hands could shape wood into voices that sang the things his heart couldn't say aloud. The most recent entries, from just before he'd moved to the nursing home, broke me completely. November 12th, 2022. The arthritis makes holding tools nearly impossible now. Dr. Chen says I need full-time care. I'm listing the house with that lawyer in Baker City, the one who doesn't ask questions. Everything goes to Michael Patterson, not my brother, but his son. I looked him up online. He has my brother's eyes and my grandmother's stubborn chin. Maybe he'll understand what I couldn't say to his father. Maybe he'll finish the violin. I sat with the journal in my lap, crying for the first time since my own father's funeral, mourning an uncle I'd never known and a reconciliation that never happened. My father had died of a heart attack 5 years ago, sudden and without warning, taking with him any chance he and Walter might have found their way back to each other. And Walter, knowing his time was limited, had reached across the divide to me instead, offering a legacy he hoped I might treasure even if his own brother couldn't. Over the following days, I threw myself into understanding Walter's work. I brought the nearly completed violin up to the house and set up a workspace at the kitchen table. Using Walter's detailed notes, I began learning the delicate process of finishing what he'd started. I had no experience with woodworking, no musical training, but I had his instructions, and something more important, a desperate need to complete this connection he'd tried to build. The farm needed attention too. I called a contractor about the barn roof, learning it would cost $8,000 to repair properly. The house needed new wiring, new plumbing, and more fixes than I could afford on my retail salary. My savings would stretch to cover the immediate necessities, but not much beyond that. I should have been worried, should have been calculating how quickly I could make cosmetic repairs and list the property. Instead, I found myself researching how to revive an abandoned orchard and whether the old tractor could be restored to working condition. Sarah called every few days, her patience wearing thin. "You've been there almost 2 weeks, Michael. Your boss is asking when you're coming back. I'm asking when you're coming back." Ibis, I didn't have an answer that made sense, even to myself. How could I explain that I'd found something in this isolated place that I'd been missing in the city? That working with my hands on the violin, walking the property at sunset, reading Walter's journals by candlelight, these things felt more real than anything I'd done in years. "I need more time," I told her, knowing it sounded inadequate. There's more here than I expected. There's nothing there but an old farm and a dead man's belongings," she replied, frustration sharp in her voice. "You're romanticizing isolation because you're afraid to face real life." Maybe she was right, or maybe real life was more than I'd allowed it to be, and I was just beginning to understand the difference. We argued, voices rising in the empty farmhouse until she finally hung up. I sat in the silence afterward, Walter's half-finished violin on the table before me, and felt oddly at peace with the possibility that some relationships couldn't survive growth, even when the growth was necessary. By the end of the 3rd week, I'd made a decision. I called my boss and quit the sporting goods store. I called my landlord and arranged to break my lease, and I called the contractor and told him to proceed with the barn repairs. I was staying, at least long enough to understand what Walter had built here and to finish what he'd started. The violin took 3 months to complete. Every evening after working on property repairs, I'd sit at the kitchen table and carefully execute the steps Walter had outlined in his notes, shaping the final curves of the body, sanding until the wood felt like silk beneath my fingers, applying varnish in thin layers that built slowly to a deep, glowing finish. The work required patience I didn't know I possessed, and precision that felt meditative once I stopped fighting it. As winter settled over the farm, I established routines that would have seemed impossible during my Portland life. I woke with sunrise, worked on repairs until my hands were too cold to continue, then moved inside to practice the finishing techniques Walter's notes described. I taught myself to install the sound post, that critical piece of spruce that transfers vibrations from the top plate to the back. I learned to carve the bridge, shaping it so the strings would sit at precisely the right height and angle. Each small success felt monumental, each mistake an opportunity to understand why Walter had made the choices he'd documented so carefully. The property began revealing more secrets as I explored it thoroughly. In the orchard, I discovered that several trees were heritage varieties, rare apples that dated back a century or more. A local horticulturist I contacted got genuinely excited when I described them, explaining that Walter had been preserving genetics that had nearly vanished from commercial cultivation. The terraced fields, I learned from a soil conservation expert, represented decades of careful land management that had prevented the erosion plaguing neighboring properties. Walter hadn't just been hiding from the world. He'd been stewarding this land with the same dedication he'd brought to his instruments, building something that would outlast him even if no one recognized the value until after he was gone. Every discovery deepened my connection to this uncle I was getting to know through his work rather than his words. In January, a woman appeared at my door. She was probably 65, silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a heavy coat against the winter wind. "I'm Dorothy Chen," she said. "I was your uncle's doctor for the last 20 years. I heard someone was living out here and wanted to make sure Walter's nephew was doing all right." Over coffee at the kitchen table, Dorothy filled in gaps the journal had left open. She'd known Walter since she'd taken over the rural medical practice in 1998, had watched him age from a vigorous 54-year-old to the frail man who'd finally agreed to nursing home care. "He talked about you sometimes," she said, warming her hands on the mug. "Especially after your father died. Walter carried tremendous guilt about the breach between them. He blamed himself for being too proud to reach out, even though it was your grandfather who'd issued the ultimatum." "Did my father know Walter wanted to reconnect?" I asked, almost afraid of the answer. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "I think so. Walter sent a letter after he heard about the heart attack, but obviously too late. He showed me the letter before he mailed it. It came back marked deceased. That's when he updated his will to include you. He said if he couldn't reconcile with his brother, maybe he could give his brother's son something meaningful." She noticed the violin on the table, nearly complete now except for final adjustments. "Is that the one he was making for your father?" "I'm finishing it, using Walter's notes." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. He'd be so happy to know that. Walter believed in the power of completion, of seeing things through even when the original purpose became impossible. That's why he kept making instruments long after his arthritis made it painful. Each one was a prayer of sorts, a hope that beauty could exist even in broken circumstances. Before she left, Dorothy gave me something she'd been holding onto since Walter's death. A small address book filled with names, phone numbers, and brief notes in Walter's handwriting. "These are the people who mattered to him," she explained. "Friends from his other life, the one beyond this farm. I think he'd want you to know he wasn't as alone as it might seem." That evening, I began calling the numbers. Many were disconnected or belonged to people who'd also passed away. But some connected me to men and women who'd known Walter in ways his family never had. Robert in Seattle, who'd been Walter's partner for 8 years in the 1990s. Margaret in Portland, who'd commissioned 3 cellos and become a close friend. David in San Francisco, who'd studied Luthery with Walter during summers and considered him a mentor. Each conversation added dimensions to my understanding. Walter had lived a full life, rich with friendship and even love, despite the isolation imposed by his family's rejection. He'd chosen dignity over acceptance, authenticity over belonging, and had built a community among people who valued him for exactly who he was. The farm wasn't a prison or a hiding place. It was a sanctuary where he could create beauty and then share it with people who understood its value. By early March, the violin was finished. I held it in the spring sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, turning it slowly to admire the way light played across the varnished wood. It was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, even to my untrained eye. But I had no idea if it actually worked as a musical instrument. I'd followed Walter's instructions precisely, but that didn't guarantee the thing would produce anything more than squeaks and scratches. I called Margaret, the cellist in Portland who'd known Walter well. "I finished the violin," I told her, "but I don't know how to tell if it's any good. I can't play." "Bring it to Portland," she said immediately. "There's someone you should meet." 3 days later, I found myself in Margaret's living room, the violin carefully cradled in a case I'd purchased for the trip. Margaret greeted me with a warm hug, then introduced me to the young woman sitting on her couch. "This is Rachel Kim. She's a graduate student at the Music Conservatory and one of the finest violinists I know. Rachel, this is Michael Patterson, Walter's nephew." Rachel was maybe 26, with kind eyes and the graceful hands of someone who'd spent years mastering her instrument. She approached the violin case with reverence, as if she understood the weight of what it contained. When she lifted the violin from its case, she gasped softly. "Walter made this?" she asked, examining it from every angle. "Walter started it. I finished it using his notes." She carefully positioned the violin under her chin, adjusted her grip, and drew the bow across the strings. The first note that emerged was pure and clear, resonating through Margaret's living room with a quality that made my chest tighten. Rachel played a simple scale, then a more complex passage, then finally launched into a piece I didn't recognize, but that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. When she finished, Rachel lowered the violin carefully, her own eyes glistening. "This instrument is extraordinary. The tone, the resonance, it's as good as anything I've played, and I've had my hands on instruments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." She looked at me with something like awe. "Your uncle was a master. This violin deserves to be heard." Rachel's words stayed with me during the long drive back to the farm. The violin wasn't just a sentimental project or a memorial to an uncle I'd never met. It was a legitimate work of art, proof that Walter's decades of isolated dedication had produced something genuinely valuable. But more than that, it was a bridge. The connection Walter had tried to build across silence and regret, finally completed by hands that carried his brother's blood, even if they'd never known his touch. Back at the farm, I began the work of deciding what came next. The property was mine, legally and practically, but I still didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. I wasn't a farmer, had no interest in agricultural production, but I also couldn't imagine selling this place to strangers who wouldn't understand what Walter had built here, who might bulldoze the barn and pave over the orchard to create something modern and profitable and completely soulless. The answer came from an unexpected source. Dorothy Chen stopped by in early April with a proposal. "I've been talking to some people in Baker City," she said. "There's a group trying to establish an arts center, a place where rural kids can learn music, visual arts, crafts. They're struggling to find space they can afford. What would you think about using Walter's workshop for something like that?" The idea took root immediately. Walter's underground workshop, preserved and honored, becoming a place where young people could learn the same kind of dedicated craftsmanship he'd practiced. The barn could be fully restored, the upper level converted to classroom space, the fields perhaps used for outdoor workshops or community gatherings. The house would need work, but it could provide living quarters for visiting artists or instructors. Over the following months, I worked with the arts group to develop a plan. We formed a non-profit, with me donating the property and maintaining a small residence in the renovated house, while the barn became the Walter Patterson Center for Traditional Arts. Fundraising came easier than expected once Rachel performed a concert in Baker City using Walter's violin and told his story. Local businesses contributed, grants materialized, and people who'd known Walter came forward with financial support and offers to help. Robert, Walter's former partner from Seattle, donated funds to restore the workshop exactly as Walter had left it, preserved as both a working space and a memorial. Margaret organized a series of benefit concerts featuring instruments Walter had made. David came from San Francisco to teach a summer intensive on luthery, using Walter's notes and techniques. The community that Walter had built quietly through his instruments now rallied to ensure his legacy would continue. I learned luthery properly that summer, studying with David and discovering I had more aptitude than I'd expected. Working with wood felt natural in ways my retail management career never had, creating something tangible, something that would outlast me and bring beauty into the world, that felt like purpose. By fall, I'd completed my first violin entirely on my own, a simpler design than Walter's masterwork, but functional and surprisingly pleasant sounding. The center opened in September, just over a year after I'd first arrived at the farm during that transformative storm. We held a dedication ceremony on a perfect autumn afternoon, the kind of day where the sky stretched forever and the air smelled of harvest and possibility. Nearly 200 people attended. Former students from the music programs that would use the space, community members, Walter's friends from his hidden life, and even a few distant relatives I'd never met who wanted to honor the family member they'd failed while he was alive. I spoke briefly during the ceremony, holding the violin I'd finished using Walter's hands as guide. My Uncle Walter lived his truth in a time and place that punished him for it. He lost his family, his brother, and the chance to be known by people like me who would have loved him if we'd been given the opportunity. But he didn't let that loss define him. He chose to create beauty anyway, to build something meaningful even if he had to do it alone. This center exists because Walter believed that art could heal what words couldn't fix, that craftsmanship could speak across silences too deep for conversation. Rachel performed again, playing Walter's violin with a passion that made the instrument sing like it was finally, fully alive. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye among the assembled crowd. We were all mourning the same thing, the years Walter had lived in exile, the reconciliation that came too late, the waste of a family's pride destroying what should have been preserved. But we were also celebrating what he'd managed to create despite it all, and the second chance he'd given me to live more intentionally than I'd known was possible. Dorothy approached me after the ceremony, squeezing my hand with the firm grip of someone who'd seen too much loss not to celebrate survival. "He would be so proud of you," she said simply. "You understood the assignment." The center thrived. Within 6 months, we had 40 students enrolled in various programs. The Luthery workshop I taught on weekends filled immediately with adults seeking the same kind of meditative purpose I'd found in Walter's notes. The barn became a gathering place, a hub of creativity in a rural area that had few outlets for artistic expression. And the farm itself, tended now by volunteers and students learning sustainable agriculture alongside their arts training, bloomed into productivity that honored its century-long history. I stayed in the farmhouse, no longer alone, but connected now to community in ways I'd never experienced in the city. Sarah and I had gone our separate ways, which hurt but felt right. She'd needed someone who fit into conventional success, and I'd needed to become someone I actually recognized in the mirror. The loneliness I'd felt in Portland, surrounded by people, but disconnected from purpose, had vanished completely in this supposedly isolated place where I'd found my uncle's legacy and, unexpectedly, myself. On quiet evenings, I still sit in Walter's workshop, now shared with students, but still containing his tools, his notes, his presence. I work on instruments of my own design, learning to trust my hands the way he learned to trust his. And sometimes, when the light hits just right and I'm deep in concentration, I feel him there, not as a ghost, but as a guide. The uncle I never met teaching me the most important lesson, that healing comes not from hiding our wounds, but from transforming them into something beautiful that others can touch and hold and use to create their own songs. The storm that collapsed the barn roof didn't destroy anything. It revealed what had been hidden, waiting for someone brave enough to climb down into the darkness and discover that even in isolation, even in rejection, even in loss, beauty persists. Love persists. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to complete what those who came before us started, building bridges across the silences that separate us from our truest selves. Thank you so much for listening to this story about unexpected inheritance and the healing power of legacy. If this story touched your heart, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to the channel. These stories matter because they remind us that it's never too late to understand the people who shaped us, even if we never got to meet them while they were alive. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever discovered something about a family member after they were gone that changed how you understood them? Or maybe you found your own unexpected purpose in a place or situation you never anticipated. Share your stories with our community. There's healing in knowing we're not alone in these experiences. And here's something to think about as you go about your day. What did this story teach you about the relationship between loss and creation, between isolation and purpose? Sometimes the most profound transformations happen when we're willing to stay in the uncomfortable places long enough to discover what they're trying to teach us. Until next time, remember that the legacies we inherit aren't always what they seem on the surface, and the things we think we don't want might be exactly what we need to become who we're meant to be.